The next stepping stone in our Vue journey is internationalization. That's a pretty big word. It's also referred to as i18n because there are 18 letters between the I and the N. i18n is the process of making your application translation ready. Depending on the needs of your project, you may need to prepare your app for translation. That's what we'll be learning in this section. It's completely optional to make your app translation ready, but there are many obvious benefits to doing so. If you don't plan on ever supporting multiple languages, you can skip this section and move on to the next one. For those of you who are interested, let's get started. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a library called Vue i18n. It's the recommended solution for adding internationalization to your app. We can use it to help us load translations, switch between languages, and translate the strings in our application. Installation and setup are relatively easy. To get started, open the command line in your editor. If the server is running, turn it off. Inside the command line, run the following command: npm install vue i18n at 9. Next, we can start configuring the library. The configuration should be outsourced into a separate file for readability. Inside the source/includes directory, create a file called i18n.js. At the top of the file, import a function called create i18n from the Vue i18n package. The function we've imported will create a plugin for the package. We can use this function to help us configure the settings of the i18n package. From this file, let's export this function from the default namespace. We can pass in an object to begin configuring the package. Inside this object, let's add an option called locale. A locale is a code that represents a language or region. Most locales are 2 or 3 letters long. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a list of language codes. On this page, the second column in the table will contain a complete list of locales. I recommend using the search feature in your browser to help you quickly find your language. You can press Ctrl F or Command F to bring up the search bar. We've been using English as the primary language for this application. The language code is EN. Locales were introduced because different languages will pronounce and spell other languages differently. Rather than decide the proper name, locales were introduced to assign codes to each language. Back in the editor, let's set the locale option to EN. Up next, add an option called fallback locale. If we're going to have multiple languages, it's possible that we're going to miss a few translations. In some cases, the user may switch to a locale that doesn't exist. If that's the case, the Vue i18n plugin will fall back to a different locale. Let's set the fallback option to EN. The last option we'll add is called Messages. The Messages option can contain a list of translations for our app. The value for this option is an object. Inside this object, the property names must be the locale. For example, let's say we wanted to add translations for English. The property name would be called EN. The value is an object of translations. Translations must be provided for all languages, including the default language. Users may want to switch back to the original language. The i18n library will need the original translations if it needs to switch back. In my opinion, I think it would be optimal to outsource the translations into a separate file. It'll be easier to focus on translations as opposed to configuring them from within the file. For this reason, let's create a directory dedicated to translations. Inside the source directory, create a folder called locales. Next, create a file called en.json. Inside this file, let's add an empty object. Lastly, back in the i18n.js file, let's import the English JSON file. Rather than configuring the translations from the file, we can update the messages object to include the English translations. As you can see, this is much cleaner than the previous solution. Our plugin is ready. The final step is to import this file into our main project and register the plugin. Open the main.js file. At the top of the file, import the i18n file. Next, below the list of use functions, add one more use function with the i18n plugin. This should enable internationalization in our app. Let's verify that the app is working by refreshing the page in the browser. Great! Our app is completely functional. In the next set of lectures, we're going to begin exploring the various functions exposed by the Vue i18n package. I'll see you there.